And we are recording. Welcome, everybody. Today is April 4th, 2019, and this is the bi-weekly SIG VMware meeting. We just switched to a new bi-weekly cadence to not conflict with SIG architecture. So this is kind of bit of a new time for us, even though it's still the same time, the same day, but it's a different cadence in terms of weeks. I guess we can kick it off with the community updates. Steve, do you want to?
Okay, just got a couple quick things. Just summarizing for people who can't patrol what goes on in Slack because they've got other things going on. But there was yet another occurrence of this question about the vCenter credential requirements when you install with Kubernetes, whether they have to be installed on master nodes only or both masters and worker nodes. The answer is that you only need them on worker nodes for the zones feature. Maybe that might change going forward, but that's the condition now. People still do keep asking this though, so it's pretty clear that it isn't clear. And maybe part of that is because the story changed at one time before zones were supported. I think you didn't need it on the worker nodes. The second one was somebody asking how to accomplish encryption of storage, I guess, during runtime and at rest. The recommendation was that they use the encryption features built into vSphere, and there's a link there that I put in the community notes. And I see Michael Gash is on the line, and he wanted some time here to talk about this subject and others, so we'll get to that later in this meeting. These two questions that users are asking on Slack are a good segue to the state of documentation. And I see that Miles Gray, who's on the call today, went and rewrote the vSphere storage for Kubernetes documentation found at the portal. Thanks, Miles. I've had a personal stuff going on, so I haven't had a chance to review that, but I'll get to it. But in the meeting notes today, there is a link to that. And if you want to say anything more about it, Miles, go for it now. Otherwise, we can move to Fabio.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so it's a little more than just a doc rewrite. I went through and pulled out quite a lot of the stuff that I would consider irrelevant. So anything pre 1.9, so 1.8 and below, with all their special caveats around naming and regexes and all that kind of stuff, that was removed just to simplify work setup and all that kind of thing. Made sure that dynamic provisioning is like the preferred method for storage provisioning and not static. Before, it seemed like static was the way to go, and you had to root SSH into your hosts and create the disks manually and all that kind of stuff. So I very much downplayed that. And then there's quite a lot of organizational changes. So I moved bits around the different sections in the menu system on the left-hand side, and then went and rewrote a good chunk of the CSS code because it was kind of annoying me that stuff wasn't lining up. So it's all nice and pretty now as well. But yeah, there's no PR open for that yet. I just wanted to get people's thoughts on it before I went and opened a PR. And if it's missing anything, I know it's missing the zone support stuff because there's an open PR for that against the current documentation. So I guess I'll do a rebase against that once that gets merged to integrate that and then open a PR back.
So the summary is I'll take some time to go take a look at it, but others on this meeting, or if you know others who aren't on this meeting, let's get a lot of eyeballs on that. And it looks like it's an improvement over what's out there, but let's do the review before we make it official.
Yeah. I have a couple of asks as well from anyone that's on this call that knows about the version history and what features were introduced when. There's a version list on there, but it's quite out of date, and I don't know where to find the information on what was introduced in 1.12, 1.13, 1.14 with respect to cloud provider vSphere. So if that could be updated, because I've had a bunch of customers asking, oh, hey, we can see you've only documented up to 1.11 on the site. Is that because that's all that's supported? So maybe a little bit more input into that would be useful as well.
Okay. Anybody on the call want to sign up for that now, or should we appoint that later? Okay, I'll let's move on, Fabio, and you can.
Steven, this is Fran. I have a question concern about the topics that you have talked here, especially the vCenter credentials required by worker nodes. I'm confused because when I was testing that early drop bits for that, we never used the credentials on the worker node. So, what is the best way to clarify that?
Well,
let me just say something there. The credential, this is specifically for the in-tree provider. The out-of-tree provider does not require any credential on the node, on the worker nodes. The in-tree provider does not require credentials if you're not using the zone support. If you're using zones, then the kubelet that is running the vSphere code, and it has to check the zones, has to talk to vCenter, and has to have credentials to do it.
And yeah, part of the confusion, Farhan, part of the confusion might be that some products, like Kubernetes product and distributions like PKS, have a different implementation of leveraging zones. For example, PKS, until recently, please correct me if I'm wrong, Farhan, was not using the automatic tagging, but was injecting labels via the startup boot scripts. So I'm not sure if this is still true for the latest PKS release, but like before the latest ones that I was checking, they were not using the zone support, but still supporting zones by this label injection during boot up.
Well, no, the question here is that I tested the latest changes using the tagging on the vCenter. So I tested that with PKS, and I was using an early bits of the Kubernetes. Well, basically all the Kubernetes. We created we compiled from Kubernetes from source just to test that, and I don't remember using credentials for the worker nodes.
And it was still working with zones?
It was working, yeah.
So, Michael, a question for you. If you are using the PKS out-of-band implementation of zones, do you need creds on the worker nodes or not?
So the latest version that I used on PKS and checked, there was 1.2, so which is not the latest one that's out there. So I just can't comment on the 1.2. So you did not need the creds there because they were injecting the labels during boot up. I'm not sure, like Farhan can comment on the latest one, which is PKS specific.
Well, the next one that we are going to, so the problem here is that the zone support is in 1.14, right? And this has been ported to 1.13.5.
No, hold on. The zone support is in 1.12. What has been added in 1.14 and is, I think about the cherry pick back is the storage usage, like the storage topology.
I see.
That is different.
Yep.
Okay, so when we are talking about zone, it's just for the nodes.
Yes.
To add the full domain label.
Exactly. Yeah. So for the record here on the call, we have in 1.12 we had the first implementation of actually being able to inject labels during kubelet registration and boot up, which has been missing before. So 1.12 added that, and this requires credentials on the workers unless, and this is something Doug can comment on, we are using SAML token-based authentication, but in 1.12, I think we were just using plain credentials. And then in a 1.14 release, we added storage topology aware scheduling, which was relying on this fact, but also needed some other changes and fixes. And Fabio, you can comment on 1.13 whether that will be cherry-picked back, which I don't know. I don't have the latest status for the storage.
It was the latest storage change was cherry picked and should be available in 1.13.5. The token authentication, I think that happened after, so I'm pretty sure that it was not cherry picked back. So token authentication is probably just going to be available in 1.14 or 1.14.1 even, which is
okay,
next version.
Can I just ask a question then from a documentation perspective about that? Because all the stuff that I've written has been around not providing the vSphere.conf on the worker nodes because it wasn't needed after 1.9, so that was removed. Should we just go ahead and say that you need vSphere.conf on all nodes to just ease it, to make it simpler, to say it's always required?
I think given that we're talking about credentials being spread out across various machines, I think it's always safer to just state it as it is, which is only required if we need it.
Mm-hmm.
Just skip it, and it will not be required once we move completely out of tree. So I think it's fair to say that this is just a specific configuration that requires having the file on. So I would say that by default you don't need it, but if you want to use zone support for compute nodes, then you have to have it.
Cool.
Yeah, I think if you just state it as if you use zones, because those older releases don't support zones anyway, right? So anybody on the ancient ones that didn't need it will not be using zones.
Right. Okay. And just to be clear, that's storage only, right? Storage zones, not compute.
No, that's
No,
compute.
No,
That's compute and
compute.
storage. Yeah, it's both.
It's both. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Anything else? Do we want to talk about these two specific issues? Otherwise, we can move on with the next segment. All right. So active projects update. There has been some movement around the cloud provider and cluster API as well. Unfortunately, I'm not super up to speed with what happened in the past 3 weeks on cluster API. I know that cluster API vSphere had a new release. I'm not sure if Loke is on the call. It might give us an update. No, looks like he's not here today. So I just want to point out what I know. Cluster API in general as a project had the very first release cut, so V1 Alpha 1, which was done, I think, the week after 1.14 for Kubernetes. So that means March 25th, I believe. And all the providers that are current with Cluster API had a new release cut. So Cluster API provider AWS, Cluster API provider vSphere, and others had the in the case of Cluster API vSphere, that was the second version because we cut the very first alpha back in December. So we have a new version out. So feel free to test it. There's a lot of improvements in terms of bug fixing, in terms of stability. Not many new features, net new features, but since Cluster API itself as a framework, as a project is in heavy flux still, I think that is expected. So there's still some sharp edges in the project. So feel free to try it out because it actually works, and it's pretty interesting to see how the project is going to evolve over time.
Now, is it still labeled alpha at this stage?
It is still alpha, yes. It is still alpha, and I just want to add if there's anybody who's interested in the evolution of the Cluster API project itself, right now will be a very good moment to get involved because there's an ongoing discussion on the use cases that Cluster API should work for. And there's an ongoing discussion on the cluster lifecycle and on the Cluster API call. There's a couple of documents out there, so it's a very good moment if you'd like to provide feedback on the Cluster API roadmap. The other update I want to give is on cloud providers. So again, we're at a very good point in Auditory Cloud Provider. We're reaching a point where we want to tag a new version and consider that as beta quality. There's an outstanding problem, which Travis is going to talk about, which is that we have two separate projects in the same GitHub repo. So we have CSI and Auditory Cloud Provider living in the same repo. So we cannot do separate releases, separate tags. So there's an outstanding item to basically split up the two things and keep Cloud Provider in the repo and move out CSI. So Travis, you want to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Also as kind of a project update, we've completed most of the additional features that we were going to add to the CSI driver. The main stuff that isn't there right now is more comprehensive end-to-end testing That is coming because there's been a lot of work on the cloud provider side. End-to-end tests are now run on VMC and kicked off by Prow, and CSI can take advantage of that now. But as you pointed out, we ran into this issue where we can't release both the CCM and the CSI binaries or projects separately. And one of the reasons, myriad of reasons, but to your point, one of the reasons we want to do that is actually that CSI is on a little bit different maturation path. So we're not ready to declare it beta yet for several reasons. And so our next release of that is most likely going to be called V1 Alpha 2. But what we wanted to do is separate that out into a separate repo. The reason it's in the same repo as CCM right now is we're following kind of a community guideline from the SIG cloud provider, KEP, for external or out of tree cloud providers. Approached the cloud provider SIG yesterday for clarification on that. We're going to modify that KEP to clarify that CSI drivers can live in the same repo, but it is not required. A couple other, mainly OpenStack, also has theirs co-located right now. Most of the other ones that are under the auspices of Kubernetes are actually under a SIG, or excuse me, a Kubernetes-SIG org. So one of the things I wanted to, in order to make that happen for us, I needed to approach SIG VMware today and see if this SIG wants to sponsor the CSI plugin as a sub-project. So that would entail it being listed under sigs.yaml or in the charter for the SIG that this is an actual supported sub-project for SIG VMware. And if we agree on that, then we can also go to the SIG VMware mailing list and say, hey, we want to create a new repo, use standard Kubernetes lazy consensus. If that's fine, file the PR to do that. It'll be an interesting one to split out. I'm going to have to level up on my Git foo to do some fun Git subtree merging to preserve all that history and then produce something that is workable. So I'm looking forward to learning some new skills there. But that is definitely an open question for today. So I'm formally proposing that I would like the CSI vSphere project to be a sub-project of SIG VMware.
So Travis, I don't have any objections, but I got a couple of questions. Like, is there any other precedent for another cloud provider SIG hosting CSI? The ones I can think of that might be in this position are like Amazon, for example.
Absolutely. So I'm happy to cut and paste some notes that I had in the SIG cloud provider meeting yesterday. But I think right now, AWS has 3, if not 4 CSI drivers. They added 2 yesterday. There was a PR. They made some press about it. Maybe not a press release, but they were vocal about it. They had some existing CSI drivers and they donated it to Kubernetes. And that meant that they formally transferred their repo under an AWS organization into Kubernetes-SIGs. So yes, the AWS SIG sponsors 3 or 4 CSI drivers. The Azure SIG has theirs, and I think technically GCE has theirs. But when I look at the CSI drivers that are out there today that are under a Kubernetes org, all of them are in the Kubernetes-SIGs GitHub org. The only 2 cloud providers that are currently co-locating their CSI plugin with the out-of-tree CCM is us and OpenStack.
Okay.
So there's precedent there.
It should live somewhere. And the plausible places, if I'm thinking as an outsider, just thinking where I'd start looking, the natural place would be storage SIG or under the cloud provider, or maybe as a standalone project. But I don't think we want it as a standalone project.
So we did. Oh, go ahead if you got more questions, but I got responses for both.
Yeah, and or not under Kubernetes at all, which I guess is another option. But the only downside I see to putting it, this is more a downside of splitting it, is are we signing up to do a test matrix? Because as soon as you make them independent, you're opening yourself up for the possibility that they're using a 1-year-old version of the cloud provider with a 1-week-old version of CSI, or the opposite. And the implication is that maybe it'd be a good idea to test all these permutations. If they're in the same one and they get released together, that can't happen. So it maybe makes it a little easier to be confident that out in the wild, these things are consistently in lockstep. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I might also loop Fabio in on that one, but we actually discussed this a little bit earlier this week in the public Kubernetes VMware cloud provider monthly meeting, and we basically recognize that I think we're going to have that matrix anyway. Even if we release them in lockstep, you're still going to have, whether you're using key.quay.io, I say key, but whether Docker Hub or whatever, but you've got all those images out there with tags and releases on them. So you can mix and match today. So I think that matrix problem already exists. And in conjunction, mainly with Andrew's help, but with Kubernetes testing, we've kind of identified that that's something that's going to have to be addressed no matter what. I don't think there's a plan for that today, but I think it's already an issue.
And then the other thing that is on a longer range agenda, I don't think this has been accepted yet, but there's a proposal to reform the cloud provider SIGs and put them under a blanket cloud provider SIGs with these as working groups. But in the interest of user support, they are still talking about then forking off the user support function of these cloud provider SIGs into some newly structured thing called user groups.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. I mean, I think so. When you were saying that there's two other places where this could potentially land, if you ignore the not in Kubernetes one would be cloud provider. And so talked a little about that with the SIG yesterday. But I think, in the long term, if all the providers do get folded in, we'll end up there anyway, but they're not ready to take that on today because they want to take a higher level approach of saying, okay, I'm supposed to write something to the cloud provider mailing list for this, but basically, all right, do we need to expand our scope to say, hey, we really should be taking a look at everything that it takes to run a given cloud provider. So that could be, that could be CCM, CSI, CNI, a load balancer implementation. And so they wanted to take a high level approach to that. And that's going to be a longer term question. So they're not quite ready to do that. And they're not currently sponsoring any CSI projects. SIG storage seems kind of like the obvious one. And we have asked them as well. I think Vladimir reported back on us for that. On that topic before, but they have taken the stance that for any kind of core file system drivers, such as like CSI, NFS, if they move some of the things like empty dir and some of the existing volume things in there that they want to take ownership of, those can live in the Kubernetes -CSI org, but they are not going to allow any vendors in there. And there's nobody in there now.
Okay, so if they don't want it, that seems pretty solid. Unfortunately, the realities are anybody working on this still has to participate very actively in SIG storage just to be aware of, their roadmap and what goes on, what things like volume snapshot and resize. So kind of looking at it from a developer perspective, having to join actively multiple SIGs is a bigger number of hours per week, but so that would be the upside of putting it there. But if the leadership of SIG storage doesn't want you there, I don't think it's viable. So I think you convinced me that putting it under the vSphere cloud provider sounds good to me.
Go ahead, Fabio. You've been waiting.
No, I mean, I just want to say that right now, the logical step is to have it under SIG VMware. So I think, we should go ahead, send the email to the mailing list, wait for lazy consensus, and then, we'll give us 2 weeks. I think we can give 1 week, given this was discussed, during this call. So we can take like a week from now to, start taking action on the outcome. I don't foresee any objection to this, but longer term, I think, what you were saying, Travis, is that SIG cloud providers should figure it out, and we're trying to help in that process. If SIG cloud provider really means all cloud provider, as in all the cloud platforms, the cloud vendors, or if it really means just the cloud provider piece that was part of Kubernetes is now moving out of tree. If the definition encompasses all the platforms, then it will make sense to have, the CNI, the CSI, all the drivers as working groups, as sub-projects, as whatever. But with SIG Cloud Provider providing overarching, words are failing me today, governance to these sub-projects.
Yeah, and if there's any way we can get this decision done ahead of KubeCon Europe, I'd like to do that just because David, who's on this call, and I are giving a talk on CSI there, and I'd hate to have it become obsolete the week after we give it. If we can at least know where this is going to end up so we can put it in our deck, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think chances are high. I mean, unless when we go to the lazy consensus method and I run into problems getting the repo created, like I expect to have this moved within 2 weeks.
Okay, great.
There's one actually good point here, which is KubeCon EU is almost upon us, so it would be a good time for SIG Cloud Provider to get together and see if we can flesh out a proposal to rectify all this, everything that is not the other three cloud providers, and see if SIG Cloud Provider is willing to to take ownership of all these other plugins that are right now without a proper home.
One other thing I'll add, and just to add weight to this, Steve, is as part of the cloud provider vSphere meeting earlier this week, I agreed to Fabio's thinking that like we're not even going to tag the next releases of the cloud provider or CSI until the repos are split. But he's ready to do a beta release, and I'm ready to do another alpha release, but we're not going to tag those until they split. So we want to make that happen ASAP.
Okay, sounds great.
And I see Luke is on the call. I don't know, Luke, if you want to give us an update on Cluster API. I just briefly touched on the new release, but I don't know what's inside.
Yeah, I read your summary, and that's about right. So Cluster API, the main repo, we're going through and updating the KEP for Cluster API, creating new use cases and requirements, and in the future we're going to split up and start redesigning Cluster API. So right now, KEP V, I will monitor issues as they come in, and I'm going to try. I talked to Fabio this morning about trying to get the ESX provisioner in, massaging it so that it's up to date with the current repo and getting it in. But other than that, I think most of our efforts this upcoming release will focus on a lot of this redesign of Cluster API. And any work that we do in CAP V will be to make sure that CAP V follows that redesign. So this is for anybody who's interested in getting involved in Cluster API. If you're looking for a good time to get in, you would never have a better opportunity than now.
Yeah, I think I said something similar before.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Luke, for the update. And from the active project update, I don't think we have anything else unless there's any more questions on what we just talked about. Okay, I guess we can move on to the open forum. So open mic forum today, we have token-based authentications on support improved security. Michael.
Yeah, this goes back to a discussion that I had last week on SIG VMware Slack, where someone was asking kind of similar related to zones and storage integrations and credentials. And Doug is on the call, so he can comment on one issue he fixed regarding this, I think, as well. So I think it just goes back to having some more clarity on which kind of authentication modes are supported with the different tie-ins we have, especially when it comes to zones and storage. Doug, you wanna comment on this?
Yeah. So the issue there was, I guess in 1.11 we added support for SAML token authentication, and in 1.12 we added zone support, which depends on the tag API. The tag API is only available with the REST API, and the REST endpoint has its own session manager. So you have to log in separately to both the SOAP endpoint and the REST endpoint. And initially we didn't have token auth support for the REST endpoint because there's no documentation for it. So that didn't get figured out until after the zone support went in. So that fix is now in master. There's a cherry pick open for 1.14. We could also cherry pick it back further, but that's kind of the current status on that one.
And so just by, I've seen all this PRs, but I think what is missing is that I think there's a little, the how to use this type of authentication is a bit foggy in terms of documentation. And I would love to see this documented somehow. I know that we have some documentation, but and this goes back to another issue that I saw over the past 3 weeks, which is somebody was trying to use the vSphere, the Kubernetes secrets to do authentication, and it was failing for some reason. I think it was just misconfiguration there, and I would love to see like even just a single page that can be then taken in and blended into the documentation that Miles is writing.
I've already done or updated the securing credentials section for that stuff. So if they want to store them in Kubernetes secrets, that section's already rewritten. So that's good to go.
Hey Doug, there was any like documentation on how to use it, like written anywhere for that PR?
I know there is somewhere, at least there.
I have a section on SAML auth. It's really ropey because it was just what was there. I haven't tried to validate it, but there is something on SAML token auth on the doc site that I was working on, but I haven't looked at it.
So if there's documentation, I guess that the only way to see if it's enough is to test it and eventually augment it with more details for whoever is going to use it, like polishing the details or everything. So Miles, if you've seen that and you haven't, as part of the documentation, is there anything you need to test it so we can help you test it, or?
No, I mean, I have automated labs that are spun up as well. So I need to test it out is all. I won't be able to do it for a couple of weeks because I'm off work for surgery stuff next week. So it'll be, a month or so before I get to it anyway.
Yeah, I don't think it's considered a high priority, but I'd love to see, all this, way of doing authentication documented in some way, somehow, and in some place where the users can actually look at it and in one place without having to hunt down this information from GitHub issues and so on. I mean, it works for us, but I guess that if somebody wants to just try it on their own vSphere instance, it might prove to be challenging to just track down all those various.
Well, the doc link that Miles sent looks perfect.
The strategy that I took for that, Fabio, what you were just talking about, is in the deployment section in the configuration bit of the new doc site. I've got one example that uses just standard user password auth in a config file. Then there's the option, if you want to do Kubernetes secrets, this is how you do that. And then there's if you want to use SAML-based auth, here's how you do that. So that's already there.
Sounds great. I love it. All right.
I have one other thing I want to add. It's not around cluster API, but it's around cluster lifecycle. This is we're going to start kicking off some work, but we're going to do it in cluster API for now. But I think it's going to be go into a separate sub project. This is around the machine stamping project. So Tim is going to start working on Tim Sinclair is going to start working on starting the requirements document gathering. So what this machine stamping is, today, if you want to use cluster API for, let's say vSphere or anything else, you need to have some node image. And today we are using just the base. We require you to download a cloud image from Ubuntu. And then deploy it as a VM template. And what we want to do in the future is that we want to be able to allow multiple OS, and we want to be able to fix the way that we pull down packages. I don't know, for those of you guys who don't know, the last couple of days before we tagged 0.2.0 for cluster API vSphere, we ran into some issues around the release of Kubernetes that was caused by Kubernetes, an update to some packages that required Kubernetes CNI 0.7.5. And the way that Ubuntu was updating their packages, which made using cluster API vSphere for every version of Kubernetes, it broke us. And because we're inside of the way that we do bootstrapping of these VMs is that we use the cloud init, and we use Ubuntu package management to pull down these images. And this issue has come up multiple times over and over. Every time that there is some kind of update or patch in Kubernetes, there's a synchronization between that and the Ubuntu and other Linux distro to make sure that their packages are all compatible. And so part of the machine stamping I'm hoping is that we can solve this problem. And so instead of relying on Ubuntu's package management, maybe we'll have a way to build these images either at deployment time, or we build the prepackaged image and store it somewhere. So that's another project that those who are interested in cluster life cycle can join in on.
Yeah, there's a lot of activity right now around machine stamping, and this is specifically if you say cluster lifecycle, but also in terms of packaging Kubernetes in general. There's been, as Luke was mentioning, a bit of a snafu on the packaging for RPMs and debs during 114.0 that had to be manually patched. So there's another effort starting right now, which will probably be hosted either under SIG Cluster Lifecycle or SIG Release, around revamping the packaging scripts. And there's a plan to build a tool to build the packages themselves. And I'm talking about specifically Debian packages and RPM packages. So if you are interested in that, there's a thread going on SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and another one on SIG Release in the Kubernetes Slack if anyone wants to follow or get involved.
So Fabio, do you know if that means that we're going to do the package? I mean, the community is going to do the packaging and give it to Ubuntu and Red Hat? I mean, how is that?
Still very unclear at the moment. Right now, there's a willing. I mean, right now the focus, the scope for this discovery phase is to figure out how to fix the current process, which is broken and doesn't scale. Next would be how do we make sure that Kubernetes has, if we want to, as a community, we want to build these packages, how do we make sure that we're building them for the right versions and we enable people that are working on these distributions as package managers or I don't know what will be called, somebody who packages for a distribution, but to join Kubernetes and work on these packs instead of creating their own. But yeah, that's still TBD. All of this is still TBD. We're in the very early stage of this conversation, but hopefully we're going to have something done by 1:15.
Oh, one last thing that's closely tied to Cluster API. Tomorrow we're going to start a new project around add-ons. So add-ons are any type of plugins or any type of anything that you want to add to your cluster once it's up and running. So we have a meeting starting tomorrow to kick off this effort, if anybody is interested in joining.
Is that cluster add-ons?
Yeah, it's at 10 a.m. If you join the cluster lifecycle, SIG cluster lifecycle group, you should see this on the calendar.
Yeah, it's 10 a.m. Pacific. All right. I see there's 2 topics from Miles. Do you want to?
Oh, well, the first one was just a link that I put in there, and Steve moved it further up. So we've already covered that, I would say. Other than if people are happy enough with the current state it's in, I'll issue a PR, and then we can just work on changes from there. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good, yeah.
Okay. The last one is more of an overarching, what are your feelings about this? So if a vSphere or a VMware customer comes along and they want to run K8s on VMware, at the minute the documentation is everywhere. So we've got our vSphere storage for Kubernetes site. There's the documentation for NSX and CNI separate to that. There's the out-of-tree cloud provider, the in-tree cloud provider. Does anyone have any thoughts of an overarching consolidation of that, like a place that we can put all of that in one place that is like the de facto K8s on VMware, this is where your documentation is location?
Good question. I see that we have Andrew Kim on the call. Andrew, do you know if the work that SIG Cloud Provider is sponsoring around documentation for cloud providers also, goes on and is comprehensive of all the other plugins that are not strictly the cloud provider?
Yeah, so I think right now the focus is the cloud provider integration, both in tree and out of tree. That is the main focus, but I don't see why we shouldn't extend that to other plugins. Obviously, we need to have a discussion around what that looks like, because I know like the documentation for like just CSI itself can kind of go on forever, and we don't want to have one giant doc that kind of sprawls to everything. So I guess TBD, but like the focus is like one thing at a time. So we're lacking provider docs right now, so that's the focus, but we can think about extending that later.
I was thinking more of the angle as if, if I'm browsing the website, the docs website, and I want to run something on a platform like VMware, and I click on VMware and I have cloud provider documentation popping up. And that is fine because I want to run the cloud provider for sure. You think that, well, first of all, let me ask this question. Is SIG Cloud Provider the right venue to bring this up, or is it SIG Docs? What do you think?
If we're talking about how we want to organize docs for all the different components that are running, that is probably a SIG Docs thing. Yeah.
The other thing, Fabio, is that this is potentially a broader issue than just vSphere, in that people might want to run it on Workstation and Fusion. And while this conversation was going on, I went to the Kubernetes.io docs, and they have a section there on how you run Kubernetes, how you get started. And there's a tabs on the left side for on-premise. which I think a lot of these are, that if I were a user curious, that's where I'd go. And there's no VMware solutions listed there. The only three that are listed are CloudStack, Kubernetes on Mesosphere DCOS, and Overt. I'm not even sure what Overt is, but VMware isn't there. Now, whether we have a main portal somewhere else, my contention is that we should put a PR against the Kubernetes docs to at least lead you there and tell you that it exists.
So there is a picking your right solution page that does link to some VMware stuff.
Okay.
So kind of going back to the question of like, how do we consolidate docs for all the different components? What I think would be ideal is to link out to CSI, CNI, whatever else from the provider docs, because for a user, the first thing that they're most likely to set up is the provider integration for the clusters. And then probably after that is probably CNI. So if we can have really solid docs for the vSphere provider, and then, you know, somewhere in the docs say, like, if you want to learn more about the CSI, then just link out to some really good docs that are under the CSI repo. I think that would be a pretty good start. And then we can work with SIG docs on if we want to make it prettier and maybe like consolidate all the different docs we have across all the different GitHub repos into like a nice page on Kubernetes docs.
Can I just give my perspective on this as a relative newbie to the whole Kubernetes thing? Whenever I started trying to find out how to run this on vSphere, which is about a little over a year ago now, I had a really, really hard time trying to find documentation. And I started on the kates.io website, the documentation site there, and it really didn't help. So to me, having the documentation spread out the way it is at the minute, where we have piecemeal, there's some stuff here, there's some stuff there. Ideally, to me, the little microsites that we have go away and it all gets consolidated into kates.io docs. Because to me, that is where people are going to go whenever they want to learn about Kubernetes. They're going to go to kates.io and they'll go, oh, look, it runs on VMware. Let me read that. But then there's no links from there to the existing documentation or otherwise. So to me, all the stuff that we have external at the minute should end up in kates.io docs at some point, because that should be the de facto point of truth from my perspective.
Yeah, I second that, although I'm going to say maybe with a modification that kates.io has to be the starting point. But if it leads to links that end up off kates.io, I'm okay with that. But you have to be able to find the things over at kates.io. There is one possible upside to having a portal that is not under kates.io, that there may be less bureaucracy involved in keeping it up to date.
Yeah,
so is it not that way already? Like, I swear that I recently, maybe a month or two ago, went and got to the the VMware stuff from kates.io.
I think it's true what Andrew said. If you go to the getting started, it does have some pointers for some of the VMware infrastructure, but they have another point where you could easily end up. I mean, my Google search led me to Kubernetes setup, and that's just a dead end with regard to vSphere. That you won't find anything there.
I think it was specifically for storage. I think it was for the persistent volumes. I think that one was the link. So yeah, it's probably, the other stuff probably isn't set up.
Yeah, so a few things to consider there is that, so the few things to consider there is that the picking your right solution page is a kind of like a dumping ground for both the provider docs for people who want to run their own clusters, and also a bunch of managed offerings. And so it's not necessarily like, it's kind of two different documentations that we're pointing out there. The other thing to consider is that the tricky thing about having provider docs in the Kubernetes docs is that at some point we're not going to be having providers natively in Kubernetes, and so it doesn't necessarily make sense to have like vSphere specific docs in that in the Kubernetes website. But what SIG docs does want is, here is all the potential providers that can integrate with Kubernetes, and just link out to all the various GitHub pages. And ideally, like that link that we link out to should just be like one consolidated page that we have.
Here's another thing I'm seeing on the Kubernetes.io docs. They version them. So in the upper right, there's a drop down where you choose 114 or whatever. So they don't try to comprehensively cover every permutation. But if we've gone out of tree, we're not necessarily synced at all to the Kubernetes versions. Yet if we put the material in the Kubernetes docs, we're going to have to live with that, and that might be a difficulty. So I think that's an argument for it living, the docs primarily living out of tree. And then we submit PRs to the Kubernetes.io docs to provide links over there.
Yeah, there's definitely some pruning that needs done in the Kubernetes docs, because just looking at it now from a on-premises VMs one, there's a vSphere one, a VMware vSphere that goes to cloud provider vSphere out of tree, which is fine. But the next one down is also VMware vSphere, and that links to using Ubuntu and Juju to install it and has no references to VMware whatsoever. So, I mean, there's definitely some cleaning up needs done.
Can I suggest to take this to SIGDocs and see what they have to say about it? Because this looks like a problem that might be a problem that SIGDocs has to fix in terms of what will be the source of truth for this type of documentation going forward. Because right now we have status quo, which we're gonna change at some point because provider will not be there anymore, and we have to change.
So SIG Cloud Provider has brought this up with SIGDocs many times, and I think we're in a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because pretty much the cloud provider docs right now, or like no cloud provider has really good docs. So essentially, they don't want to invest time into like kind of consolidating things without having like tangible docs to work with. And so I think what we need to do is write those vSphere docs and then hand really high standard docs to SIGDocs, and then kind of apply pressure that way to have them give us some sort of landing page for all the docs that we have.
I think with the work that you might have done on this, I think we're in a good position to lead by example with SIGDocs. Maybe it's a good thing to just go there and try to make clarity of what will be the next step for SIGDocs in terms of documentation by using the SIG VMware, the documentation that you put together as the example, and ask other providers to do the same.
So to Andrew's point then, if we point to a single source of truth, which ideally is what we're going to, that if they go to kates.io, they get a single link, and that single link takes them to like this is the everything you need to know. That would be cloud provider vSphere, like the main page, and that will link off to CSI, CNI, whatever, and they'll have their own discrete sections. Is that what we're saying?
This sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, same here. I mean, it doesn't have to be the cloud provider vSphere repo. It could be something else, but the general idea, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's actually I will say that having it under Kubernetes cloud provider vSphere makes a lot of sense, instead of having one random repo under the VMware org, and just having some documentation there that says vSphere storage, Kubernetes. But having it under Kubernetes, we have a Kubernetes. If we have a cloud provider vSphere repo under the Kubernetes core org, we should use this as an authoritative kind of presence in terms of documentation.
Just to expand on what Steve was talking about, the versioning that they have in the Kates docs, because I've been looking at some OpenShift docs and stuff recently, the versioning to me works really well, because it's a point in time, this is never going to change, known good. Whereas to me, if we document this stuff within the repo that the code is hosted in, the problem that we're going to have is that we can't really run any kind of versioning system on there, whether it's Jekyll based or whatever kind of system that you want to run, that'll let us pick these different versions. Is there any value to having the docs in a separate repo to the code?
Is there any reason we can't just branch the docs, or branch the cloud provider repo and just update docs there based on and match the version with upstream?
Yeah, sure.
I feel like we can talk about this offline, but yeah. I am planning to put a little bit of work too into the vSphere docs, so I can sync up with you, Miles, later.
Okay, yeah. Let's talk offline, Andrew.
Awesome.
Sounds good. Looks like we're almost at the top of the hour. Anything else you guys want to bring up? Going once, twice. All right. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. See you in
Bye,
2
everybody.
weeks.
Bye.
Bye.